dwelling on how Russia might invoke international law in bad faith, and how we might counter such uses. Is it better to shut them, or is it better to expose them for what they are? My preference is to expose them for what they are. Do the Ukrainians think that international law is dead? Many of them seem to think it is, and understandable somewhat, but I'm not sure if uh, that explains this international law more broadly. Maybe it's a very singular and a specific impression to them. That leaves us with where I stand right now, that is in places like Sweden. Does international law continue to matter? And the answer seems to be a resounding yes. I have noticed three things. In places like Sweden and Norway, the decisions to supply Ukraine with arms and weapons have stirred a huge debate amongst international lawyers and government officials as to whether it is in fact lawful to do so. Do such supplies violate neutrality rules, the law of neutrality? Can such actions be explained as third-party countermeasures? In other words, Russia breaks international law over its action in Ukraine, that being the internationally wrongful act for which Russia is responsible. Third states, non-injured states such as Sweden and Norway, resorting to countermeasures by selectively declining to observe their obligations that they owe vis-a-vis Russia. So the law of neutrality, among other things. The second thing I noticed is something I might call the power of Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. So, contrary to, clearly, it's quite opposite of what Mr. Putin had expected by invading Ukraine, that NATO would become suddenly so popular. More states end up gravitating towards NATO than before February 2022. But I just wonder what the reason is. And the reason, it seems to be, the most compelling reason is the power of Article 5. So if you can listen to what NATO says and come to some views about this. So NATO, among other things, had said that it would not help Ukraine, but it will defend every inch of NATO territory. And what is it that can be expected of states joining NATO now? And that must be the commitment that they, together with the existing members of NATO, would make under Article 5. That must be the compelling attraction. And the North Atlantic Treaty is a treaty. It's a piece of international law, and it has very sort of compelling appeal. Even Russia takes Article 5 seriously, not in a bad faith kind of way, but it actually thinks that Article 5 is credible. That's why it's so nervous. And the third thing I noticed is the double standard that Western states have displayed in the treatment of Ukrainian refugees vis-a-vis other refugees, and the war in Ukraine vis-a-vis other conflicts. And this also includes the momentum that we are now seeing rapidly build in the West for international crimes trials that would seek to hold Russian officials to account. We have not witnessed such initiatives take shape so rapidly and so widely in response to more recent conflicts elsewhere. Do Westerners see their own images in the face of Ukrainians, victims fleeing Russian aggression? Is that what explains? So going back to the first observation, why does the West care about its behavior being lawful or unlawful according to the law of neutrality? If you want to help Ukraine, one might say just do it. But for some reasons, the West seems to take sort of their governance through law. I don't know if the rule of law is the right expression here, but their governance through law and their law-based commitment or undertaking very seriously. And at least when it comes to framing their own actions, they often seem to think that legal justification has intrinsic value, or the legal justification about what they do. Can we justify our arms supplies to Ukraine under international law? If the answer is yes, that's great because it justifies it. If the answer is no, that worries them. So the lack of legal justification also seems to carry some intrinsic value, the negative value, that is. So it's but what's interesting about this debate in the West is who the audience of this debate is. And the audience of the debate raging here right now is the West itself. It's not addressed to Russia. That's clear. Russia is not going to care whether the Western arms supplies to Ukraine is lawful or not. If Russia wanted to disrupt it, it would. And the addressee is clearly not Ukraine either. It's, in fact, self-preoccupation. The West is preoccupied with itself as to whether what it does accords with international law. And that also resonates with the way in which Article 5 is seen. Those who are members of NATO or those who seek to join NATO see value in the commitment that's implied under Article 5. So it's, in fact, all about how we are as the West. It's almost as if we are what law we apply to ourselves. That's how you identify yourself. But this is obviously good and bad. The way the West applies its own laws to itself clearly leaves much to be desired when it comes to dealing with non-European matters. We know from news footage how African nationals fleeing Ukraine in the early days of the conflict were treated very differently at the Polish and the European Union's eastern frontier, and how, unlike other refugees coming from conflicts elsewhere, Ukrainian refugees are given this extraordinary leniency in the way they are permitted to reside on EU territory and seek jobs and other things. So because I think ultimately actions like that are not done from the other regarding point of view about international law, but about out of their self-regarding views of who they are from the international law point of view. It reveals this double standard. So in principle, we would expect murder to be criminalized everywhere. It's a matter of principle that unlawful homicide be punished. But when it comes to, so let's say, how would we react if someone you know or someone close to you is killed nearby, as opposed to a total stranger killed far away that you learn of through some news? Your reaction would be completely different, if understandably, because you feel familiar, you feel the kinship and familiarity. And that is perhaps what explains the difference between the way the West has treated Ukrainians as opposed to other refugees. But this is only an explanation of who we are, rather than whether it is proper that we do. To make it worse, the extraordinary outpouring of sympathy and support that we are witnessing vis-a-vis millions of Ukrainian refugees is maybe something Michael Walzer once called a universal moment. Although, in fact, it's not even universal. Maybe it's a regional moment, a spontaneous expression of solidarity and shared sense of justice. But it could sour very quickly. I dread the prospect of the West turning against their Ukrainian guests. Once it becomes apparent, for example, you know that right before the war started, Ukraine had one of the highest rates of unvaccinated citizens when it comes to COVID. The double vaccination stood at something like 34% of the population. Now they are pouring into the European Union. Similarly, Ukraine had one of the highest rates of tuberculosis worldwide. They are coming now. So if once Ukrainians kind of overstay their welcome and the public health system of the European Union starts to feel the pressure, I don't know how welcome they will be. I worry because it's not pinned, it's not tied to principles. It's tied to sympathy and emotions of kinship. And I think this is where the real danger lies. By way of concluding, what I'm witnessing reminds me of the torture debate that used to ravage the United States. That was during the first half of the 2000s. You know, Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo and so on. And distressed by the undertone of the debate suggesting that torture might be permissible in extreme circumstances, the late John McCain said, no, this raises a matter of who we are as Americans. Do we want to be a people who torture, who are okay torturing individuals? The implication was that we are better than that. So, yes, I see that. The West seems to be practicing this idea that because we are law-abiding people, that includes abiding with international law, and that continues to make international law relevant. But as I said, it is there is something fundamentally self-regarding about it. But law is not just self-regarding. It is meant to be other-regarding. It has rules and principles that are meant to be applicable and upheld everywhere. In other words, treating like cases alike. We shall see how, in the long run, whether the West continues to take international law seriously. If the West abandons that, then I fear international law will be in real danger. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now, if anyone from the audience has a question, you can type it on the chat, or if you want, you can unmute yourself and say it. It is up to you. And probably before that, maybe I can ask my question, because you touched upon the question of international organizations and Russia's participation, membership,
Yes.
in fact, there. And my question is, what will happen with the pending cases before the European Court of Human Rights, for example?
I am not an expert on European human rights law, so I don't want to, let's say, make a fool of myself by saying something incorrect. But so I don't know. Is it are all pending Russian cases to be going to be thrown out, or are they going to be adjudicated? I don't know if there's any residual clause in the European Convention that says that, yeah, even after expulsion, the cases that have already been initiated, the court would continue to have jurisdiction over them. I don't know what the actual provisions are, but as a layman, I would imagine that if there is no possibility for new cases against Russia to be filed before the European Court of Human Rights, that seems to be an obvious consequence if Russia ceases to be a member of the Council of Europe and if it exits the European Convention. Yes, there too. One of the expressivist values that international law has is to expose bullshit arguments bare. So if Russia were to, let's say, be dragged through these cases and the judges, the European Court were to come down hard on Russia, stating what the law is, despite all of these spurious arguments that have been advanced on Russia's behalf, that I think has value. So it would be I think it's a pity that opportunities like that will be lost because we feel strongly about, let's say, punishing Russia, expelling Russia from forums like the European Court. That's how I would feel about it.
Thank you. And if anyone else has a question, or if you don't with this, probably we can finish today's lecture. And one more time.
There's
Yeah,
a
there's a
there's a
question.
Just a
question.
quick one. I wrote just the question because it was too long to just say it right now, and I wrote it, and I'm going to actually read it now. It is in relation with the mines in the Black Sea region, because currently there are mines in that region, and both parties, Ukraine and Russia, are blaming one another that they are responsible for these mines. Are you aware if anything happens, because currently it remains unproven, who placed the mines, who would bear the responsibility, and just whether actually having such mines in the Black Sea is a violation of international law or the Geneva Conventions, or both?
Whereabouts are the mines? I didn't get the geographical location of the mines.
Black Sea region, or in the
Generally,
Black Sea.
generally.
Generally, I think they are around the Odessa region because that's where Odessa and up to the um, Ostrov Zmijski, which is on the border with Romania.
Hmm.
There was, I think, an ICJ decision in relation to that island and the delimitation concerning it between Romania and Ukraine.
I mean, if someone other than Romania lay mines in Ukrainian territorial waters, for example, that would clearly be a violation of international law. It's fairly simple there. If mines are laid, let's say, on the Ukrainian coast, on Ukrainian territorial waters, let's say by Russia, then from a strictly IHL point of view, it may not necessarily be unlawful. I think there is a parallel obligation, at least. I'm not sure if you would override the rights of the belligerents to lay mines, to somehow safeguard some sort of safety of navigation. But I'm not sure how far that would go into rendering the laying of mines unlawful per se. If Ukraine did it, because we don't know who did it, yes. If Ukraine laid mines on its own territorial waters for defensive purposes, that would seem to be lawful. I don't think the Geneva Conventions or Additional Protocol 1 or the let's say the law of the sea, including the law of naval warfare, would prohibit Ukraine from laying mines on its own territorial waters.
The
If
issue is when the mines, because of extreme weather conditions, move away from the original designated place. Then it actually breaks laws.
Okay, yeah. Obviously, if that jeopardizes otherwise safe, let's say, navigation, then yes, that would be a different story. But I wasn't sure if that's part of the situation that's being described. And there's a separate obligation on the part of those whoever it is that laid the mines to demine them when the situation ceases to require them. So. I hope that helps.
Thank you very much for the answer of the question.
Okay, any other questions?
I do sort of a question, sort of a comment. I'll try to, actually explain properly. When you were explaining the concept of international organizations, NATO and the sorts with regards to international law and preventing conflict, etc., etc. You also did mention that now people are saying these organizations should do something against Russia. And the reality of the situation is that every time a big player on the world stage did something against these organizations' principles, usually the organization in its history never actually did anything due to the fact that this player had too much soft power, too much actual physical influence. Yes. Therefore, I feel like people are not learning their lesson that these international organizations are on goodwill basis. So if somebody does not follow them out of goodwill, effectively, they are very hard they are in a very difficult position to do anything. So I feel like people should not rely on them. Rather, it should be a case where they should accept that they have a purpose, but I feel like people overestimate their purpose, and perhaps maybe people should be more educated on the subject matter rather than always saying, "Oh, they did something bad. Please tell them not to do something bad." In reality, that's not how the world works. Be it if America does something wrong, usually America gets away with it. If Russia does something wrong, even though they get, let's say, scolded for it, they will still get away with it in some capacity when we think about it. So maybe, do you believe there's a way to educate people to have a more, let's say, realistic way of viewing stuff?
I think what part of the explanations has to do, I'm sure, to do with the intensity, how intensely people affected by violence want that violence to be dealt with. How intensely they want something to be done about it. If what they are left with is their themselves, then that would aggravate their sentiments quite. I don't find that very difficult to imagine how I would feel about it if I were in their shoes. You would feel very lonely, I'm sure, and existentially anxious. And so you would want everyone, to do something. And a visible symbol, perhaps as you say, overrated symbol of that includes the United Nations. But it's not so much. I mean, I don't think there's much. I'm not sure if there's much we can do to, let's say, educate, as you put it, victims of violence about how little the UN is meant to do or is capable of doing when major players have let's say decisive stakes at the high table. But I don't know where I was going with this.
No, it's fine. So instead of education, you could say like preparation, because in the end of the day, even if the United Nations says, okay, we will deploy our own troops for peacekeeping, in reality, that adds another layer of complexity, which could be a bad thing, could be a good thing. But also research shows that all the times United Nations Blue Helmet troops were involved, the situation usually would get worse for the civilian population, which is a worrying trend is in the organization that's all about peace. But its peace corps are inefficient. That doesn't show that the organization is doing what it should be, being efficient at solving issues of the violent variety.
Yeah, I agree. The one thing I was going to say is that perhaps the organizations such as the UN are overselling themselves.
Yeah, and they're doing it for obviously PR purposes, and having something to people to hope in is a good thing, obviously. Putting your hopes in something means that inevitably it could be more efficient. But I feel like the United Nations, for its own good as an organization, should either restructure itself so it can either do more or lower the expectations so it does not disappoint the civilian population. The governments are one thing, but let's be honest, the more important aspect of every nation is its people. The government can change from day to day, but the people will always be there.
I think that one of the tragedies of global institutions like the UN is that it was set up to do things, but it was not given the tools to do it, with which to actually do it effectively. So there is the mismatch, but that mismatch is not, let's say, the organization does not own up to that mismatch. So there is always this tension between what it says it stands for and what it actually does on the ground. And obviously that doesn't help manage the expectations of those who are supposedly the beneficiaries of UN action. But it happens, I'm not even sure if this is a unique phenomenon for international organizations. Depending on how intensely you experience injustice, you may feel similarly about systems generally. So the wronged, the person who underwent extreme injustice and who have not received, let's say, justice in the end. It happens, and maybe perhaps more often than we would like to admit. So it's not so much that other systems perform significantly better in comparison to the systems that we are now looking at, like the UN. But perhaps it's the, somehow the uniqueness, the perceived uniqueness of the suffering, like aggression and genocide and so on, that somehow translates into this desperate expectations that there is someone like the UN to save them. And as you say, maybe the UN is not the savior that it wants to be. And people should know. I guess they should. Or maybe they shouldn't. I mean, I'm not sure if it's necessary that they know what to expect and not to expect of the UN. It's just the fact that the UN doesn't deliver what people want. So I'm not sure what the solution is. But as you say, it's a comment, more of a comment than a question. So.
Yeah, but still, thank you very much for your time, of course.
Okay, so if you don't have any questions, I will ultimately put an end to this lovely lecture and discussion that occurred. And thank you again for saying yes to our event. And we do hope to see you in the future in any further lectures or whatever events we organize.
I would very much welcome an occasion like that.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Have a good evening.